Welcome, everybody. If we can close one of the doors in the back, just so we don't have too much crowd noise from outside, one of those doors would be great. Thank you. My name is Jeff Grieco. I'm the Deputy Chairman of SID-Washington. Welcome to our lightning talks today. This is something very exciting and new for us. We had a competition for these that was quite intense. There are no losers in our view, but today you're going to get to hear the winners of our lightning talk contest, which was open to all of our SID-Washington members. They're each going to give a talk of about 10 minutes. We do have a timer. Paul Sherman, who I should recognize from SID-Washington, is one of the awesome staff for SID-Washington. Very lucky to have him. It'll be about a 10-minute lightning talk on a subject related to international development. We're not going to introduce them because they're going to introduce themselves as part of their stand-up. And they're going to use the stage if they want, but they're free to do whatever they would like as part of their presentations. And we don't have any Q&A time for these sessions, but afterwards I'm sure they're all going to be very happy to meet with you following the event. It's about 45 minutes. We're going to stick to that. Paul will be tight on the timer. And if anybody has questions on anything afterwards, come and see me. I'll be down here in front. And we're ready to kick it off with our first presenter.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. How many is this one?
No, it's voice activated. It should once you start talking.
Hello? How's that? Anything? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, my name's Ryan-Silva. There we go. My name's Ryan-Silva. I work for DAI. I run something we call the DAI Maker Lab, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. So it's hard to get exact figures on this, but it's a good bet that last year something north of 30 billion microprocessors were produced around the world. And that's 30 billion with a B. And on the one hand, that's kind of an astonishing number of anything to be building in just 1 year. But on the other hand, maybe it doesn't feel all that surprising. After all, we've all gotten kind of used to the idea that digital technologies are involved in pretty much everything that we do. And that includes in our development work. So I know at DAI, our Center for Digital Acceleration applies digital tools to traditional development problems like applying machine learning algorithms to connecting qualified applicants to job openings in our Women in Workforce Development project in Afghanistan, or building platforms to connect citizens with their municipal governments in Central America, or connecting farmers to hyperlocal information that helps them adapt their planting practices to deal with climate change. And for your organization, even if your organization may not have an explicitly digital strategy, I'm quite sure that you're using digital tools in the course of your everyday work. And I'm sure that because we all do. Digital technologies everywhere. So maybe the surprising thing about that 30 billion microprocessor number is that something less than 5%, and probably a lot less than 5% of those microprocessors went into general purpose computers. Things like servers, laptops, phones, and tablets. The rest goes into what we call embedded devices. So these are devices that have digital logic embedded in them, but that are designed to do just one thing rather than run a series of different software programs. And we're surrounded by these embedded devices all the time. I'm holding one in my hand. I'm wearing at least one. When I went to the bathroom earlier and I washed my hands, an embedded device turned the faucet on and off for me. Didn't do a great job, by the way. So it's not crazy talk to say that embedded devices kind of run the modern world. If our digital strategies only involve the software that runs on servers and on phones, that's an awful lot of tools that we're leaving on the table that we could be applying to achieve development outcomes. So fortunately, over the last few years, we've seen the emergence of new tools and approaches that enable us, with a much lower barrier to entry, to design these embedded devices and to make them in quantities that make sense as a development implementer or as an NGO or as a mom and pop business in a developing country, rather than as a consumer electronics manufacturing giant. And so that's my job at the Maker Lab. I use these emerging tools and approaches to build hardware and build capacities around hardware in support of our projects, the projects that DEI implements around the world. So what does that look like? Well, in Cambodia, we worked with a local NGO to design a flood early warning system. So this is a piece of hardware. Usually we hang it off the side of a bridge, and it uses sonar to read the level of water under that bridge. And every 15 minutes, it uses the cell phone network to send that information to a cloud-based server so that can be logged and analyzed. But if the water reaches a level that's above a yellow or red danger level that's been set in the software, it triggers an interactive voice response system, an automated phone system, to make a voice phone call to 10 or 15,000 people downstream within a few minutes, so that they get hours of early warning of rising floodwater without regard to any barriers they might have in terms of literacy or the kind of phone that they own. In Indonesia, we're working with small water utilities to create a suite of open source hardware that will allow those utilities to track the kind of data about what's happening in their distribution networks that a Western utility might track. Information that they weren't able to track before because it's simply not affordable for them to do that. So for example, one of these devices is our water pressure telemetry meter that uses an automobile pressure sensor, an oil pressure sensor that you could buy at any auto parts store anywhere in the world for $10 or $15, and uses that to collect pressure information in near real time around that network so that they can provide better, more efficient, safer water service. In El Salvador, our Bridges to Employment program is sponsoring makerspaces. So these are sort of like co-working spaces with tools that will be used as a platform for youth to pioneer new workforce skills that are not currently present in the workforce and that none of the vocational institutions locally are providing because they're just too new, but that industry is demanding because they see that their international competitors are using them. In the Philippines, we're currently working with a German technical university to develop a device that does acoustic monitoring of dynamite fishing so that we can actually triangulate the location of a dynamite fishing event in real time, both to give coastal protection authorities the ability to track those incidents and catch the people who are doing that, but also so that we can collect data around where those incidents happen, when they happen, how often they happen, so that we give tools both to those enforcement authorities, but also to citizens and the national government and other interested parties so that they can advocate for protection of their coastal resources. So these are some of the things that we're doing with hardware. This is work that we've been doing for almost the last 5 years. And we started doing this not because donors were asking us for it, but because we saw all of those unused tools that were being left on the table and realized that we could leverage those to do better development work. So the way I figure it, 29 billion microprocessors a year kind of can't be wrong. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. So I was reading this fascinating article in the American Economic Review a few months ago. I really grabbed your attention with that, didn't I? But bear with me for a minute. The article is called Delegated Expertise, Authority, and Communication. It's written by two economists, Demon and Salai, and they're 25 plus pages of equations using just about every letter in the Greek alphabet is premised on a simple idea, which is that people in authority, so say policymakers, are likely to assume that their delegated experts, say policy advisors, are biased. Now, by bias here, they don't mean discrimination. What they mean is that they assume that these delegated experts or advisors are more likely to give advice in the direction of their own personal interest. And they're more likely to do this because they're human. But this assumption of bias means that the policymakers are likely to discount a little bit that information that they're getting from their advisors. That doesn't mean they discredit it entirely, but that means that they might take this advice with a grain of salt or some room for doubt. And this room for doubt, in turn, means that the value of the information going to the policymakers is a bit lower. This makes sense, right? So once again, economists have taken something that's really just common sense and they've made it seem really, really complicated. But this article got me to thinking about the discourse that we've been having over the last decade or more about policy-based or evidence-based or evidence-informed policymaking. I think it's fair to say, I really hope it is fair to say that everyone in this room agrees that policymaking and program design should be informed by good evidence, where good evidence includes both best practices and the findings from research. Okay? But there's been a recurring question in this discourse about who is best to bring this research evidence to policymakers, or who should speak truth to power. It's my thesis here today that we, development practitioners, should be playing a bigger role in speaking truth to power, because we can be and should be better able to present research findings in an unbiased way. Now, researchers do talk a lot about policy engagement. In the early days of the impact evaluation boom, a lot of researchers did not see it as their responsibility to bring evidence to policymakers. One well-known development economist would often say, "It is my job to make sure my research is published in the best journal possible, and it's someone else's job to find that evidence and translate it into policy." Now, more recently, the pendulum's really swung in the other direction, and we see a lot of researchers who are highly engaged with policymakers, from the very beginning of the study to the end when they present their findings. They say, "Don't worry about giving policy advice, you practitioners. We've been to the country a few times in the last several years. We know the minister personally. We got this." But the evidence that they bring to policymakers at the end of their study is going to mostly be based on the results of their study, in which they are understandably highly invested. So a smart policymaker is going to recognize that even though those findings are going to be very relevant, there's probably going to be some bias on the part of the researcher. And in any event, no policy should be based on the results of a single study. Even a good pilot program scaled up should be evaluated at scale before it's written into policy. And this is where we, as development practitioners, can be delegated experts who have less bias when bringing evidence to policymakers. We can demonstrate that we're not biased by bringing a body of evidence from best practices and research to the table. But what do we need to be able to do this? We need three things. We need accept, access, and assess. And no, don't ask me to say those in a row again. First, as delegated experts, as advisors, we need to accept responsibility for bringing evidence from multiple forms to the table, for bringing both best practices and findings from research. Okay? Now that's the easy part. Access. There are really two parts to access. The first is that we need to be able to find relevant research to us, and the second is that we need to be able to access those documents with published research. Now, I'm willing to bet that most of you, I'm going to say that none of you in this room has time to go out and conduct a search of an academic database, to screen the thousands of hits that you get, and then to read dozens of academic studies. Is that a fair bet? Yeah. But fortunately, researchers are doing this for you more and more often. In the last decade, we've seen a growth in the kind of research called systematic reviews and evidence maps. These are studies that are really research about research, where the researchers take the time to conduct these searches, to do the screening, and to read the articles that have relevant evidence for you. So by using these kinds of studies, you as delegated experts can add research evidence to your expertise. But that leads us to the second part of access, which is that you need to actually be able to get these published documents. Now, this is where the open access publishing movement and the big fights between institutions like the University of California and publishers like Elsevier matters to you. Findings from research don't do any good outside of academe if people can't access them without having university libraries. So the open access publishing fight matters to you, and you should join that fight. The third piece is assess. You need to be able to assess the quality and the relevance of the published research for your evidence needs. Now, contrary to what many academics might tell you, not every piece of research published in a journal is good research, really. And contrary to what some academics may say, it takes more to understand whether or not research is high quality than just knowing whether or not a study was an RCT, really. But it doesn't need to be very complicated. And there are people who span practice and research who can help with training and tools that make it easy for smart people like you to get what you need from published research without having to understand every Greek letter-addled equation. So, who should speak truth to power? You should speak truth to power. We should all speak truth to power. To do that, we need to accept responsibility for bringing evidence from both best practices and published research. We need to be able to access that by both finding those studies and being able to get to them. And to do that, we also need the skills and the tools to assess the quality and the relevance of that research to our and our policymakers' evidence needs. But we can do that. So go forth and speak truth to power.
Not me either. Okay. In 2007, in the village of Rahira, Uganda, an international development organization initiated a project to help farmers move away from growing matoke, a local food staple, and toward growing maize. The aid experts reasoned that maize was more nutritious, it was drought resistant, and would produce higher yields than matoke. And produce higher yields it did. That year, much more maize was grown than was needed. Unfortunately, transportation costs were too high, and the farmers couldn't bring the maize to market. They didn't have storage in the community, and so the maize sat there and rotted, and the rats came in. We might think that this less than ideal outcome is the exception in development work, but it is all too often the rule. The Project Performance Database is the largest collection of performance indicators for development projects, generated from 14,000 projects across eight aid agencies. While the data itself is likely rosier than the reality, because it is based on the agency's own self-assessments, it still reveals that 40% of development projects fail. Foreign aid has reached $150 billion annually. If the project performance database is any indicator, that means we throw away $60 billion each year. And what is more disheartening than the wasted money is the fact that we disempower the very communities that our well-intentioned efforts were meant to help. It is for this reason that I believe that how we work with communities is more important than what we work on. We are in the business of solving the problem of poverty. We are smart, tenacious, caring, resilient, and dedicated servants of those people who are most marginalized. And if we are to believe the statistics, we aren't particularly good at what we do. I'd like to think that we have come to accept a high level of failure because our work is extremely complex. It involves the interwoven social, economic, and political forces at local, national, and global levels, as well as the physical realities of working in developing countries. Even when we try to isolate and package a development project as a water and sanitation project or as a women's entrepreneurship project, we see that the parts that we have isolated are in fact connected to other parts and to other parts outside of the scope of the project itself. And we ignore or are restricted by the processes and the structures that we've developed in order to take these connections into account. Take, for instance, poor learning outcomes in a classroom. The students may be struggling to learn because of the lack of training that their teachers received, or that teachers don't spend enough time preparing their lessons, or maybe because the teachers aren't paid consistently. Or maybe it's due to the fact that students do not come to school consistently, or that they travel long distances, or that they do not have electricity in their homes in order to do their studies after the sun goes down. Though this may appear to be a list of independent factors that can be fixed one by one in isolation, they're in fact very much interconnected. The teachers do not prepare their lessons because they haven't been properly trained, but also because they have little extra time after working on their farms since they are not paid consistently and need an extra source of income. Students do not come to school because they have to travel those long distances, but also because they have to do their assignments during the day because they don't have the light to work by at night. This problem isn't simply about education, it's about energy and infrastructure, it's about transportation and governance and livelihoods. These many interconnected factors give rise to a result which cannot be addressed by tackling each factor separately, but must be understood and addressed as a whole. So how do we solve these complex challenges? We must leverage the assets of communities through empowering them to see in new ways. We need to help the community to gain clarity itself on what is happening and how to address it. Human-centered design and systems practice, when done well, help do just this. While the particular methods of human-centered design and systems practice are very useful, the real power of these methods is in the process itself. Human-centered design and systems practice bring together community. Through collaboration and iteration, the community unlocks the potential that already exists within it. The communities where we work are teeming with a wealth of knowledge, of passion, of skills which far too often go unutilized. Often, like most persistent problems, the community may be too close to the problem to see it in new ways. Human-centered design and systems practice allow the community to see things differently through creating the space for sharing diverse perspectives, developing a common understanding, and from this foundation, identifying agreed upon ways for moving forward. These processes require trust, not always an abundant commodity. But when human-centered design and systems practice are used effectively, they facilitate the building of trust within community. And what is important, what makes these approaches effective, is that they allow the emergence of collective solutions. It is not simply about creating a forum for discussing competing perspectives or ideas, but about creating a shared understanding from which solutions can emerge. While human-centered design and systems practice both have their advocates, you do not have to choose between them. They are complementary approaches, which are even more powerful when used together, and I would argue should be used together. In order to see differently, we must zoom into the particulars of the situation, understanding the lived experiences of those in the community, as well as zoom out to the broader patterns and underlying principles at work. Human-centered design as a process that focuses on deep empathy for community members is ideal for learning about these lived experiences, while systems practice as a process that focuses on the relationships between elements in a system is ideal for seeing the bigger picture. And many of the strengths of systems practice compensate for the weaknesses of human-centered design and vice versa. For example, human-centered design relies on trial and error cycles, which can be inefficient at arriving at the right problem to solve, whereas systems practice brings clarity around specific leverage points to engage. Systems practice focuses solely on analyzing and conceptualizing the complexity that is inherent in the problems of development, whereas human-centered design is action-oriented and focuses on prototyping and testing solutions. Our work can truly benefit from applying both the human and exploratory process of human-centered design with the relational, big picture, and strategic process of systems practice. Human-centered design and systems practice provide two powerful practices that can shift how we work to avoid the results that played out in Rohirrim. How we work is more important than what we work on. For those who use human-centered design and systems practice, I encourage you to allow these approaches to transform the way that you and your organization work. View them not as tools, but as a fundamental shift in how you do that work. We must hold one another accountable to being thoughtful in how we engage with communities. We must hold each other to a higher standard about the messages that we send through the processes that we use. This means intentionally creating and holding the space for communities to lead their own development. Human-centered design and systems practice can help us hold this space so that communities can come to recognize their assets and their strengths, so that communities can create a shared path forward, and so that communities can step into their own power and bring about the change that they seek. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Trevor Hayes.
Hi, and I'm Maren Lundgren, and we work with the Kaizen company.
Yep. And today we're going to tell you about an innovative project that we have in education in Liberia that I'm hoping measures up to the standard that was just set out for us.
So the sharing economy was popularized by services like Uber and Lyft, and it's revolutionizing the way that we think about supply and demand. Services like these match a need, like people looking for a ride, with a resource, like people with the capacity to drive, and they link the two by means of an incentive, extra income for the driver. We think that there's an untapped need that can be filled by matching local resources to local needs in local communities, and that's what we are going to talk to you about today.
So in Liberia, the Kaizen company saw an opportunity to help close the ever-widening education gap with a program that we call Learning Links, which we fondly nicknamed the Lift of Learning around the office. So today we're going to tell you a little bit about the education gap in Liberia and what that looks like. We're going to talk about our pilot solution, Learning Links, and then we're going to outline some of the innovations that we think could potentially scale globally.
What is the problem? Well, in Liberia, around a third of young girls become pregnant during adolescence. And the current practice of the government of Liberia is that when a young girl starts to show signs of pregnancy, she's forced to drop out of school, and she faces a large social stigma. These girls then miss out on access to important literacy and numeracy skills that they need to help improve their livelihoods to support both themselves and their new children. The education system is moving on without these girls, and opportunities become just out of reach. They get trapped in a cycle of poverty. So the question is, how can these girls tap back into the resources that an education can afford, access to those important literacy and numeracy skills that they need to get resources like jobs for themselves and their children?
So our solution essentially focuses on a model for development that facilitates the transfer of local resources. We connect existing resources in these rural communities in Liberia, particularly in the form of literate and numerate women who are already there, and we connect them with girls who have dropped out of school and who are eager to learn. We do this using an incentive model, and we use some simple SMS technology. And the model focuses on the idea that while overall literacy in Liberia is low, 10 to 20% of women in rural communities are literate and numerate, and we make them the cornerstone of the solution.
Here's how it works. We identify potential participants, as well as numerate and literate women within the Liberian community, and then we administer placement tests to both groups. We then match the women who are literate and numerate, they become our tutor mentors, with the participants, or our learners, and then we assign each tutor mentor a level of literacy and numeracy to teach to her group of learners.
So after we pair the learners and the tutor mentors together, we conduct our grouping. We give both groups phones. We also give them a copy of the Government of Liberia's Alternative Basic Education curriculum, and we provide some training for how to utilize the systems. We keep the groups small, typically around 5 girls per tutor mentor, keeping in mind here that we're working with education paraprofessionals in the community who we've identified and provided training and support to. The girls typically attend 3 lessons a week, and that can occur anywhere in the community. So it's very flexible. It's a very flexible model. For each lesson they attend, there's 3 SMS quiz questions that are sent to the learners, which is facilitated by our database and meant to measure their learning. And for every correct answer that the learner answers, she and the tutor mentor both receive a small monetary incentive that's meant to encourage participation and continued learning.
This SMS quiz system not only helps track the progress of our learners, but it allows us to generate massive real-time data on our tutor mentors as well. And this helps us to continuously iterate and innovate the processes that we use for this Learning Links model. For example, we can follow up with our tutor mentors based on the results we're seeing from their learners, and then provide additional training and coaching in the areas where it seems like they're needing support. We also can continuously tweak our incentive system to optimize levels of performance and to help then, of course, incentivize continued participation in the lessons by both the tutor mentors and the learners. And we can even follow up with low performers and provide additional coaching and support that's targeted to their needs, which we've seen because we have massive amounts of data on every learner and tutor mentor.
So what are the results? Learning Links is a really small pilot project, but some of the initial results that we've seen from this work have actually been pretty promising. Measuring SMS quiz performance over the life of the project, we've seen girls typically perform around the 70% mark, regardless of whether they're working on literacy or numeracy, and kind of irrespective of level. To us, that indicates that participants are learning, they're able to retain the content of the lessons that their tutor mentors are conducting, and they're able to apply that on their quizzes regularly.
Right, so we combine 4 really unique and proven activity elements in our Learning Links model. One is the tech-enabled freelance business consulting model like we see with Uber and Lyft. 2 is a tutor-mentor-enabled learning model. 3, pay for performance to achieve results. And 4, SMS questions to monitor education progress. These 4 realms combine to create a new learning space in Liberia that's both safe and very flexible. It allows our young women to learn during pregnancy as well as their early stages of motherhood when they can be located close by their tutor mentors and receive continued support. And we believe that this not only has the possibility to impact these young mothers in Liberia, but that it could scale to reach millions globally.
Fortunately for us, and for scaling, mobile penetration is really at an all-time high. That means we can easily provide a rigorously monitored learning environment. Constant data collection means that, as Maren mentioned, we're always adapting, iterating, and learning about how to use this kind of sharing economy model for development. And our incentives enable a high degree of participation while improving livelihoods and providing opportunities outside of the formal education system in Liberia.
Right, so while we've deployed this model, our Learning Links model, in rural Liberia to benefit young mothers who have had to drop out of school due to pregnancy, we believe that it could be just as easily tweaked to help young boys who have had to drop out of school, refugee populations, youth seeking employment training, and many other contexts. We believe that this has the potential to scale because it's rooted very deeply in a local capacity that exists around the world. Literate and numerate, but underemployed women. So by tapping into this local resource and really empowering these women to both share their knowledge and make use of the knowledge that they have, we believe that we can scale this to reach millions and to get learners around the world learning no matter what context they're learning in. Thank you so much.
Thank you.